Gonna make it through this darkness. A light would shine someday for me. Yes, it will. I know that you won't leave me in this thing. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you'll put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. I'm breaking the silence 'cause I'm under attack. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. And take my life back. And take my life back.
By way of reminder and reinforcement, we see here the project goal to develop a multidisciplinary, community-based empowerment intervention for sensitizing community members, reducing the incidence and prevalence of child sexual abuse and incest, and HIV transmission within the selected communities. Specifically, the community intervention model would help to achieve two of the stated project objectives: generate new gender-sensitive knowledge and an understanding of child sexual abuse, incest, and the implications for HIV/AIDS, and to empower individuals to understand and address child sexual abuse and incest and its implications for the spread of HIV. Now, the model emerged originally from an academic exercise. This began in 2006. The members of the team for the larger project, Gender, HIV, and Sexuality, collaborated at that time with colleagues who had experience working in the area of child sexual abuse. And these persons included Professor Adele Jones, who was the keynote speaker at the opening ceremony last night, and Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who was here with us this morning. I'm not sure if she's in the room now, probably stepped out. But following these discussions, which were basically academic discussions, the idea of a community caravan came up. And after a discussion with persons from the Rape Crisis Society. And why the Rape Crisis Society? Because the Rape Crisis Society had previously used this type of intervention in communities. There was someone who this morning shared that the Rape Crisis Society had a Breaking the Silence project. She said it. I'm not sure. I hadn't heard that it had been given a title. But certainly we know that the Rape Crisis Society had a community caravan approach to community intervention that looked at health and wellness. And after discussion with them and discussing the experiences that they had and the success of the intervention, it was agreed that the Breaking the Silence project would implement a community caravan utilizing an action research approach. A draft intervention model was designed, funding was secured for the intervention, and the decision was taken that for a community intervention, the on-the-ground implementation was better facilitated by a community-based non-governmental organization. So a collaboration was therefore established with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. It was determined by the research team, again as an academic exercise, that the community caravan, a roving wellness fair, would, for a period of 1 year, once per quarter, access 3 communities, 2 in Trinidad and 1 in Tobago. The caravan would be manned by a multidisciplinary team and would provide service to adults. In addition, the draft intervention model would deliver child-centered educational interventions in the primary and secondary schools in the said communities. Deriving from the pilot intervention, the plan was for a standardized training module to be designed. For adults in the community, it was felt that the community caravan would provide a holistic, multidisciplinary approach to child sexual abuse, incest, and HIV/AIDS. The interventions would focus on social mobilization, edutainment, and an information campaign on child sexual abuse. As well, prevention workshops would take place, providing education on the effects of child sexual abuse and incest, HIV prevention, the available services, female condoms, and microbicides. Assessment and diagnosis would take place through establishment of community surveillance methods for identifying and responding to incest, developing women's skills in risk assessment and protection, and assessing psychosocial needs of incest survivors, including voluntary testing and HIV, voluntary counseling and HIV testing. Treatment, care, and support would have been another facet, and this would have involved provision of antiretroviral treatment, post-incest counseling, treatment adherence counseling, group work, and a confidential drop-in facility for children. That was the model proposed by the research team. It was well thought out, and it was fed by the research literature and by the experience of the Rape Crisis Society. It was felt that that is what was needed to increase knowledge and awareness of child sexual abuse and HIV. The thing is, though, that the decision was also taken to engage in action research. I think this slide just looks at the multidisciplinary team. We looked at 5 specialists, a domestic violence, HIV/AIDS counselor, health professional, social worker, county social workers, county health visitors. Those last 2 professionals, the county social workers and the county health visitors, were included because we were considering the sustainability issue as well. And it was felt that if you utilized health professionals from the very communities, the intervention would have been more likely to be sustainable. So the decision was taken to engage in action research. Let's look a little bit about what action research is. One definition of action research from Gilmore et al. Reads, action research aims to contribute both to the practical concerns of people in an immediate problematic situation and to further the goals of social science simultaneously. Thus, there is a dual commitment in action research to study a system and concurrently to collaborate with members of the system in changing it in what is together regarded as a desirable direction. Accomplishing this twin goal requires the active collaboration of researcher and client, and thus it stresses the importance of co-learning as a primary aspect of the research process. In other words, this approach proposes that people learn best and are more willing to apply what they have learned when they do it themselves. That is one of the facets behind action research. So put another way, action research emphasizes the scientific study, but also ensures that the intervention is informed by theoretical considerations, but also spends time refining the methodological tools to suit the exigencies of the situation. Action research collects, analyzes, and presents data on an ongoing basis. So what we had at that point was an intervention that had been derived out of theoretical considerations and a commitment to work with the community in ensuring that this proposed intervention was in fact the appropriate one for the various communities. It meant then that this intervention had to be taken to the people in the communities. So to facilitate this, we had to engage in a few first steps. Firstly, to get community involvement in the process of refining the model, we had to have meetings with key stakeholders in the community. We had to establish a project advisory committee. The communities had to be selected, the communities where the intervention was going to be piloted, and we decided that we had to establish community liaison teams. To this end, 2 stakeholder meetings were held, one in Trinidad and one in Tobago. These brought together about 60 participants from governmental and non-governmental agencies and organizations. And in these stakeholder meetings, data was gathered on the concerns and issues surrounding child sexual abuse. These meetings were not community specific. These meetings looked at targeting stakeholders from the 2 islands who had any kind of vested interest at all in child sexual abuse and the management of child sexual abuse. In these meetings, support was solicited for the project. We were really looking to get buy-in of the stakeholders, and advice was solicited from them on the best approaches. What was obvious at that time from these stakeholder meetings is that people were aware and very concerned about the whole issue of child sexual abuse. They lamented the lack of resources, and even though they were saying, yes, there is a need to do something about it, the taboo nature of child sexual abuse was still like an overshadow. They were saying, yes, we need help, we want help, but this is a taboo subject and we don't know where to start. Simultaneously with these stakeholder meetings, I have here a slide. Okay, this is an example of feedback that we got from the stakeholder meetings. And this slide shows you an example of feedback from the Tobago stakeholders meeting. At the Tobago stakeholders meeting, it was suggested that in spite of not having resources for immediate impact, the project should start putting the issue of child sexual abuse into the media. This, together with feedback from other partners, stimulated the emergence of the media campaign. And it was at that point that the project hired a media consultant. And I think that everyone knows what the eventual outcome of that was. Simultaneously, a project advisory committee was established. Who constituted that committee? This was a group of stakeholders with expertise and experience relevant to sexuality research, gender-based violence, and child sexual abuse. What was the role of the project advisory committee? The project advisory committee was to provide input and feedback to the research project team on the design, development, implementation, and evaluation of the project. You saw this slide earlier this morning. It shows the individuals who accepted our invitation to be on the project advisory committee. And I think it was noted at that time this morning that they actually represent a range of relevant disciplines and agencies. We have representation from the legal arm, service provision, education, outreach, and of course a representative from the Tobago House of Assembly. The Project Advisory Committee had particularly useful discussions as we began talking about this community caravan. One example I would give to you, which was in fact a very prolonged discussion because there were so many challenges involved in coming to some kind of decision, was the issue of when we take this community caravan into the communities, and when we start to do all of this HIV testing and this education, what are we going to do if someone were to disclose that they had been a victim of child sexual abuse? Or what if a child disclosed that he or she was currently being sexually abused? That's the kind of discussion that allowed the Project Advisory Committee to give us some kind of input. Of course, the legal persons were adamant that reporting was the law and it had to be done. The persons who were more into service provision were concerned about the fact that, okay, when you report, what is likely to happen to that child? Because the services do not exist to be able to support a child if it goes to the police and the child is taken from the home. Steve Williams from the Ministry of Education was able to share with us what was the policy with the guidance counselors in the Ministry of Education, and through discussion with Project Advisory Committee members, discussion with the project team members, and seeking advice from other experts, such as persons who were involved with us in the legislative review, we were able to come to decisions that influenced our interventions and our management of the project. One of the bigger issues that the project team faced, and which also benefited from input from the Project Advisory Committee, was the selection of the 3 communities in which the intervention would take place. The communities were eventually selected by the research team based on input obtained from both the 2 stakeholder meetings that had been held and discussions with the Project Advisory Committee. Consideration was given to ethnic, religious, and socio-economic diversity, and that's because we did not have the resources to do a national survey. But at the same time, we wanted to get a fairly reasonable idea of what was happening in Trinidad and Tobago. So we felt that if we chose 3 communities that at least had the spread of diversity that existed in the country, the findings when we presented them would have been a better reflection of Trinidad and Tobago. So we looked at ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic diversity. We looked at urbanicity. We wanted to be sure that we had a mix of urban and rural locations. We looked too at accessibility by researchers. It is not possible to just get up and go into a community and say, we have come to investigate child sexual abuse. We had to have some way of being introduced into the community, and the contacts that were available, we had to utilize, and they did influence which communities we would choose. And of course, in this day and age, we had to look at the issue of safety of researchers. Some of the interventions that we were proposing involved researchers spending a lot of time into the community, and we wanted to be sure that our researchers would have been safe. Avoidance of stigmatization. As we began to discuss this and we began to come up with the possibilities of different communities, we were particularly careful that no community would think that they were being selective by virtue of some preconceived notion that there was a high prevalence of child sexual abuse. The prevalence of child sexual abuse in the various communities in Trinidad and Tobago is not known, and we did not select communities based on any alleged or preconceived notion of how much incest or child sexual abuse we were likely to find in that community. After months of discussion, toing and froing, we eventually selected 3 communities. And these 3 communities, as you know, were Tobago, a rural, agricultural, and fishing community consisting of 13 villages located along the northeastern coast of Trinidad. Most of the community members in Tobago are of African descent and Christian religion. We also selected the Aranguez El Socorro area, an urban area lying along the urban east-west corridor in northwest Trinidad. Aranguez El Socorro is composed mainly of housing and industrial areas, and this community is predominantly Indo-Trinidadian, even though there is a significant representation of Afro-Trinidadians. The main religions in this community are Islam and Hinduism. Charlottesville is a rural fishing village way north in Tobago. Charlottesville has, again, predominantly persons of African descent who are Christians. So with these communities selected and the proposed intervention in place, as a scientific endeavor, the project intervention had to undergo the rigor of ethical approval. Ethical approval was sought and obtained from the Ethics Committee of the Faculty of Medical Sciences of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Throughout the study, it was ensured that all participants were voluntarily recruited and provided informed written consent for their participation. Confidentiality was ensured at all times, and all data was adequately secured. In addition, permission was obtained for all photographs and media clips. You would notice that you have been viewing a lot of the media, the documentary of activities that took place and faces are visible, persons can be recognized. Our ethics approval ensured that we obtained permission beforehand for all of the persons who were going to be photographed or videotaped, and that they were aware that it was possible that they would be used in various media clips. To gain an understanding of each of the communities, the next step was to conduct 3 ethnographic case studies in each of the community. In the absence of available trained ethnographers, in what turned out to be a capacity building exercise, the project trained field researchers in ethnography. These researchers spent 3 months in the community, admittedly a short time for ethnographic work, but a reflection of some of the financial and time constraints that we were experiencing. The specific goals of these ethnographies were broadly twofold. 1, to collect data from community members on child sexual abuse and how it is understood in the community, and 2, to sensitize community members and prepare them to receive the intervention. Using social maps, participant observation, conversations, key informant interviews, and attendance to community activities, for each community, field researchers gathered data on family structures and patterns in the community, the social history of the community, how family relations, child sexual abuse, and incest are understood and experienced in the community, how children and young persons are perceived and treated in the community, and the sexual norms, attitudes, and taboos in the community. All the while, though, the researchers who were conducting the ethnography would be noted any gendered differences and differences among the different ethnic, religious, socioeconomic, and social groups. The data would then be analyzed to achieve the following goals: to gain an understanding of the community, the people, and the culture, to gain perceptions of attitudes towards family and sexuality, to explore the occurrence of child sexual abuse and incest, to explore the possible causes, attitudes to, tolerance of, and understanding of child sexual abuse and incest, and to assess the community's knowledge on the relationship between child sexual abuse and incest and HIV. Some of these findings would be presented in a session tomorrow when we look at the findings from the research. There were, however, several lessons that were learned in the conduct of these ethnographic case studies. In particular, lessons were learned concerning community access. In Togo, we learned very clearly that it was important to have influential, trusted, and well-respected contacts. Togo Foundation was considered by the community to have the authority to grant access to the research team. Togo Foundation is a non-governmental organization in Togo, and by establishing a facilitative relationship, it was possible for our researcher to have very early introductions to key people in the community. As a result, the field researcher was readily accepted and got very easy access and detailed information quickly and easily. It was interesting, though, that I think Togo was the first community that we went in, and we were very cautious as to how the issue of child sexual abuse should be approached and discussed. So we tried to disguise and couch it in family life issues. So when we went in, we did not really tell people that we came to investigate child sexual abuse. We told them that we were discussing family life issues, that we wanted to look at family relationships, and that we would be collecting data on how persons communicated in families, etc. It turned out that explicit descriptions of the purpose of the research and the methods to be employed were actually quite well received and did not appear to prevent any kind of communication on the topic. Sometimes, as happened in Charlottesville, that kind of facilitative adoption into the community occurs much less formally. In Tobago, it was formal because we had the Tobago Foundation. In Charlottesville, however, which is a small community, the field researcher lived in the middle of the village. She was readily adopted, so to speak, by a popular and prominent community member who informally facilitated her integration into the community. So there was no problem with her, even though we did not have that kind of established NGO to make the introduction. The researcher found it very easy to establish relationships and make connections to get the necessary information. It was noted, however, that the characteristics of the ethnographer may be important for a specific context, because in this setting, we were not able to get a field researcher from Tobago to go into the Tobago community. And I don't want to talk too much about the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago, but suffice it to say that for a small, closed community, when we could not get a field researcher who was Tobagonian, we thought that it would be prudent to use a non-Trinidadian researcher rather than a Trinidadian in a setting like that. And the person who was placed in the Charlottesville community was actually not a Trinidadian. So by doing that, we avoided the possibility of any evoked suspicions or any concerns about a village in Tobago being labeled or stigmatized. The experience in Aranguez El Socorro was, however, a bit different. And it showed us that having contacts may not always ensure access, but does not always guarantee good field relationships. The challenges to building networks in Aranguez were related to the spatial organization of the community. In Aranguez, where there are a lot of industry and mixed with the housing, you didn't have compact residential communities, and it was very difficult for the researcher to establish very close friends in a timely manner. Worse than that, the community members tended to work outside of the community, and our field researcher did not have the opportunity to live in the community because it proved difficult, if not impossible, to get accommodation for her in the community. So you found that she would enter the community in the morning. The members of the community who were living there would have gone out to work. The persons that she was interacting with were actually persons who worked in the community. And even though we had a contact person, introductions occurred within a specific cultural subgroup, and the kind of development of relationships that occurred in Tobago and in Aranguez, and in Charlottesville, did not readily occur in Aranguez. What we learned there is the ease and the rate at which the sensitive topic of child sexual abuse and incest data was broached in Tobago actually reflected a working presence and fruitful relationships between field researcher and the community, emphasizing the importance of this in any kind of ethnographic case study. The ethnography, apart from giving us data about the community, also prepared the community for participation in the intervention and refinement of the model. Field researchers identified a minimum of 10 key stakeholders from each community, including community members and service providers working or living in the community who later participated in our service provider research. And these persons were identified for future in-depth interviews, participation in the service provider surveys. They became members of the community liaison team, and some of them participated in the intervention. So the project now had 3 distinct but overlapping teams. We had the research team, which was the academic driving force, which had the responsibility for ensuring research standards. They were responsible for the methodology of the intervention, and they were constantly receiving feedback and data from the communities. We also had the project implementation team, and these were the on-the-ground NGO staff who themselves, some of them were members of the research team, and they had responsibilities for implementation and data collection. They took feedback they brought feedback back to the research team. And then we also had the community liaison teams, which comprised the key community members who assisted the study teams to identify local issues related to the project. They also facilitated the link between the project team and the community and facilitated entry into the community and acceptance of the interventions. These community liaison team members participated in training workshops to increase awareness and knowledge of gender, child sexual abuse and HIV, and implementations for HIV. This is a diagrammatic representation of the relationship between the teams. You see that there was a connection with each of the three teams. Between the academic team and the target communities, the academic team members were involved in training of the members of the community liaison team, and they too, that's the academic team, when they were present in the community, would collect data. Then there was the relationship between the communities and the NGO, the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and members of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence team were also members of the research team. So there was an establishment of teams with a constant flow of information from community through the NGO to the research team, from the research team to back to the communities through the NGO, and sometimes directly from the research team to the target community. Following the ethnographies, stakeholder meetings were held in each community just prior to the proposed intervention, and at that time, remember, we were still thinking that we were going to implement our community caravan. The research team gave basic feedback to the communities. We had not yet analyzed the data from the ethnography, but we were able to tell them about the occurrence of child sexual abuse, the reports of prevalence of child sexual abuse, and the fact that community members felt that they needed an intervention. The research team then introduced the proposed intervention model based on feedback directly to the research team. And in smaller community meetings, communities then shared what they identified as their own needs based on the individual circumstances and culture of each of the communities. The communities identified and accepted that child sexual abuse was a problem, that it needed to be a focus of attention, but they objected to the proposed model. Not all the communities favored that community caravan kind of health and wellness feel. For example, in Tobago, the community stated very explicitly that they did not want a centralized community caravan. They had been regularly exposed to health education and screening, and they felt that that just would not work for them. Instead of an intervention just in Tobago, what they suggested is that the project should actually focus on 3 locations on the coast in order to reach persons from more villages. Because when interventions take place in Tobago only, all of the persons in the other villages distant from Tobago actually were not able to benefit. And the community identified their own needs as they wanted to provide community members with sustainable skills. They wanted support for the counseling center at the Tobago Foundation. And Radio Tobago, which is a radio station dedicated to that area of Tobago, they felt that what they would benefit from was a pre-recorded dramatic soap opera presentation by persons living in Tobago with assistance from the project. So the community was able to very clearly verbalize what they felt would work for them. And certainly what we had in mind was not what they needed or wanted. Now, what was interesting to me in all of this, and remember now that I am coming from a different kind of background altogether. I am a psychiatrist. I'm coming from a medical background. It was always a topic of discussion in our research meetings that medical scientists are very precise, very black and white. We need to have everything measured. We wanted numbers. I was constantly looking for numbers. The social scientific approach is a bit different. And what I found very interesting, after having to get accustomed to the fact that, hey, I was never going to get any kind of numbers or structure, that the research team, when we went to the communities, basically all the communities were asking for the same interventions. The only thing that differed is that the actual target group that they were asking for differed according to the individual community needs. But they all wanted education, skills training, and service provision. So having received that kind of feedback from all of the communities, the project team went back to the drawing board. In addition to the direct feedback from the communities, other factors were also considered in this new model development process. We looked again at the studies from the ethnographic case studies, the findings from the ethnographic case studies. By that time, we had some findings from the service provider studies that was giving us a little more information about what was happening with child sexual abuse in the communities. And these findings were continually fed back to the communities through the NGO, meeting with the community liaison officers, who then gave recommendations for intervention. We also incorporated a gender sensitization component. And this is what really makes this project distinctive from every other project of a similar nature. We were adamant that every intervention must consider an awareness of the differential risk, differential treatment approaches for men and for women, for boys and for girls. What we also had to incorporate into the model was an integration of research. And at each intervention, note takers were employed to collect data on the session itself that would help us later on to evaluate the session. Field notes were reviewed, analyzed, and again fed back into the model refinement. And we had to, integration of research, notes taken, the information taken by the note takers were also used to help us to refine the model. Because remember, when you have a meeting, the note takers are taking notes, they are recording discussions, they are recording how the community members feel about child sexual abuse, they are recording just the information that we need to understand the child sexual abuse. And by identifying their needs, we were able to continually refine the model to produce something that was relevant for each of the communities. So here is an attempt to make a diagrammatic representation of how the model was panning out by that point in time. We started off with a draft intervention, which had been influenced by bibliographic data and by reports of a previous field experience by the Rape Crisis Society. That draft intervention, through feedback from stakeholder and community meetings, feedback from the Project Advisory Committee, the service providers' reports, and the ethnography findings, resulted in a modified intervention, which was further modified by the integration of evaluation mechanisms, the integration of research findings that kept coming to us from the community, and the gender sensitization. Output was a community-specific gender-sensitive intervention providing educational, skills-building, and service provision activities to increase awareness of child sexual abuse and incest and the implications for HIV, all with a built-in evaluation component which also generated new knowledge on child sexual abuse and incest and HIV. Are you with me? Yes? Okay. If we look now at some of these community-specific interventions, what I'm presenting to you now then would be the result of all of the refinement. I'm looking at the educational interventions. In Toco, it was agreed by the community members that what would benefit them were educational workshops for secondary school teachers, drama-based workshops for secondary school students, and interactive street theater for men and women. In Arangwes El Socorro, the educational content comprised seminars for secondary school teachers, interactive theater for men and women in community social settings, and drama-based educational workshops for secondary school students. Charlottesville, on the other hand, focused on seminars on gender, sexuality, and communication for male and female parents and caregivers. They too wanted interactive theater for men and women in community social settings, and it was decided that storytelling theater for primary school teacher was an appropriate intervention for the Charlottesville individuals. You would notice that the interventions differed, and they differed based on where the community was starting out. Toco, with the presence of the Toco Foundation, was pretty much far ahead of the other communities in terms of having received basic information. So what they were ready for, the other two communities could not have appreciated. So each of the interventions was in fact very focused, very specific to the community needs. Similarly with the skills building activities, in Toco, it was decided that there were persons had already received training in dealing with HIV, in talking about HIV, and what they wanted now was training in crisis intervention skills for homework center facilitators, teachers, and social workers. One of the findings that had come out of the discussion is that a lot of homework facilitators would have young children who would spend hours with them in the afternoon after school, waiting on their parents. And very often it would come up that these children were in fact victims of child sexual abuse. And these facilitators did not feel competent to handle these disclosures. So they were saying, if you want to help us and if you want to make a difference in our community, what we really need is to be trained in crisis intervention skills. And the persons to be trained are these homework center facilitators and the teachers and the social workers, the person who are receiving the disclosures from the children. Toco also requested training in facilitation skills to run support groups for the empowerment of women. And after discussion, it was felt that the development of skills relevant to producing radio drama presentations would have been an excellent intervention for youth in the Toco community. The skills building in Aranguez, El Socorro, and Charlottesville were a little different. They looked more at effective parenting workshops to train community members to start parent support groups. In Aranguez, cottage meetings had already been taking place, and the forum was a good one to start looking at protecting our children. So the intervention for skills building in Aranguez, El Socorro were cottage meetings for a forum on protecting our children. In Charlottesville, it was determined that we would develop skills for child sexual abuse and HIV-related poetry writing and produce a dramatic presentation on family life issues. Now, those of you who were here last night, you would have heard the poems that were presented by the youth from Charlottesville. Yeah? Anybody was here last night? Now, to be able to write a poem on child sexual abuse, you inevitably become sensitized. You have to be educated. You have to become comfortable with the issue. So through this strategy, which resulted in individuals who afterwards, at the family day that took place in Charlottesville, were able to share their skills with the community. That was the right intervention for the persons in Charlottesville. Service provision for the three communities. In Toco, we looked at establishing a community support group for the empowerment of women, whereas in Aranguez and Charlottesville, they were quite appreciative, and it met their needs to have a family day that was facilitated by local and national service providers offering education on child sexual abuse, incest, and HIV, as well as youth-friendly skills-building workshops. Now, you know what is so interesting in this whole thing? That one intervention mirrored what we were looking to provide to the community on an ongoing basis over a period of 1 year. You see the difference between what we initially proposed and what eventually came out? And that was through action research, getting the needs of the community and incorporating what the community needed and wanted into the original model. Overall, the activity goals were the same. The objective of each activity was to educate men, women, boys, and girls on child sexual abuse and incest and the link with HIV. Another objective was gender sensitization, and the third objective was to collect data, research data which would inform us as to what was taking place in the community, evaluation data that we would later use for our evaluation component, and media data, because for all of these sessions, photographs were taken, video clips were taken, and we therefore had data that could be used in the media campaign. These objectives were clearly described with measurable indices of effectiveness. The target groups, however, and the specific methodology that was used were guided by the uniqueness of each community. And how did we know the uniqueness of each community? Through the findings from the ethnographic case study and through continual feedback from research findings brought to the research team from the community through the project implementation team, through the community caravan team. Yeah? Okay. All right. I just wanted to highlight here, but we've done it already, that the skills building, if we look at skills building, for example, the skills building was the general approach in the model. The target population was different depending on the need. So in Tobago, it was the homework center facilitators. When we were doing the training for facilitation for the parent support groups, we had to have persons who met specific prerequisite criteria. We were looking for persons who at least had had some exposure to counseling before. And the target group here was youth and young adults who were interested in developing radio drama presentations. In Arangwes, the target population was different. It was more parents, general community members, and adults who work with young persons. Likewise in Charlottesville, parents, young persons, and persons interested in developing dramatic presentation. The methodologies were different. I will just leave you to go through the slide. In Tobago, training workshops were held with the homework center facilitators to develop crisis intervention skills as it related to child sexual abuse and related matters. We had workshops on the development of facilitation skills to run the support groups for the empowerment of women. And likewise with the youth who were producing the dramatic presentation, they developed skills relevant to producing radio drama presentations. And one of the outcomes of this intervention was the development of an actual radio dramatic presentation related to child sexual abuse. These strategies were different to the ones employed in Arangwes and Charlottesville, those seeking to achieve the goals that had been set for those two communities. Now, one of the most challenging components of the project was the monitoring and evaluation component. Even though it was challenging, that was actually a very critical element of the entire research project. It is, if you want to have a model that you want others to utilize, it is imperative to be able to demonstrate that the model is in fact effective in achieving what it set out to achieve. We conducted the monitoring and evaluation component of the project in collaboration with the Caribbean Health Research Council. They were an external body trained in this area who in fact conducted the monitoring and evaluation and assisted us with conducting our final evaluation. We looked at the two goals that we set out to achieve. One, to generate new gender-sensitive knowledge and an understanding of child sexual abuse and incest and HIV implications. The model activities generated new gender-sensitive knowledge. We were able to get from the communities information that had not been previously documented. Through 50 education and skills building workshops conducted in 3 communities, note-taking from each of those activities, recorded data from each session, and debriefing sessions with facilitators were also conducted by members of the research team at the end of every session. So we have data. We do have new gender-sensitive information, some of which you will hear about tomorrow. We also disseminated this information. We generated reports including the study of service provision related to child sexual abuse incest in Trinidad and Tobago, and a findings report from the ethnographic case studies of 3 communities in Trinidad and Tobago. And already we have disseminated this information through this conference, the regional conference. We also had a poster presentation at the International AIDS Conference held in July 2010 in Austria. We did a presentation at the Caribbean Studies Association Annual Conference in June 2009. We did a workshop at the School of Education. All of our final reports are in the IGDS UWI libraries, and we have conducted various media interviews, and various media articles have been published. Break the Silence radio soap opera will soon be on the air, and we have the Break the Silence media campaign. If we look at all of this, we would be inclined to say, yes, that goal was accomplished. New gender-sensitive knowledge and an understanding of child sexual abuse and incest has been accomplished. But evaluation asks us to objectively answer the question, how do we know? How do we know? Now, when we looked at the strategies that were used to collect information to help us to do the evaluation, community stakeholder meetings gave us information about whether women, men, and children were being empowered to understand and address child sexual abuse and incest. The community team meetings gave us feedback on this as well. Capacity building meetings, the model activities, the national media campaign, the Break the Silence radio soap opera, all of these would suggest that we have achieved these objectives. But we must ask the question, did the intervention model build awareness, knowledge, child sexual abuse, incest, and HIV implications? And if so, how do we know? We must have data to show the impact. Our initial approach was to do pre- and post-test evaluations through knowledge, attitude, and intended practice questions. But critical feedback showed us that this was not working. The non-response rate was very high. The participants were reluctant to engage in tests, and the facilitators sometimes forgot to administer that. So we had to employ other evaluation strategies, such as pre- and post-intervention evaluation scenarios. We created scenarios that participants in the activities would comment on before the activity. And after the activity, we gave them the same scenarios, and we looked for changes in their responses. We conducted post-intervention focus groups, and we conducted narrative summaries. We obtained narrative summaries of workshop participants' change in knowledge, perceptions, and attitudes. I think I have, I don't know if it's 5 more minutes, 2 or 1, but just quickly, how much, Professor Reid? None, okay. So in my minutes left, I'm just going to show you very, very quickly. Did the intervention model empower women, men, and children to understand? Okay, let's jump to this one. We looked at awareness and knowledge indicators. 74% of participants from all 50 education and skills building workshops implemented in the target communities demonstrated accurate knowledge on gender ideologies, child sexual abuse, and implication for HIV. All participants recorded having a clearer understanding of child sexual abuse, incest, and how to cope with its occurrence. All reported increased knowledge of available CSA and incest prevention and treatment resources, and the Blue Teddy campaign was cited as the most likely source of their knowledge and information. Teachers, participants in TOCO, 70%, 56%, 86% reported increased knowledge. In Arangwes, 93% of 151 teachers, etc., etc. Impacting communities. This was a question that was asked earlier this morning. Following these skills building workshops, community support groups have been established in the communities. There are 2 CSA support groups for women survivors of CSA and incest, founded in TOCO in 2010 by participants of Women's Empowerment Skills Building workshops held in 2009. A community-led parent support group was founded in Charlottesville, similarly by participants of the Parent Support Skills Building workshop. And a community-led parent support group was founded in Arangwes by participants of the Parent Support Skills Building workshop. One Homework Center was founded in Toko in 2010 by a teacher who had participated in the Crisis Intervention and Parent Support Group Skills Building Workshop. And in addition to providing support with homework, this center also now aims to provide parents with information on parenting and child development. National impact? Well, we are seeing the Blue Teddies, the number of callers to radio and TV programs, hits to the Facebook calls, signage viewing, participation in marches, attitude to the marches. We have evidence that shows, certainly from the preliminary inquiry, that the project has made a difference. Thank you.
We now have on here with us some of the people who participated in implementing the model. And they are going to give some brief presentations on their experience in their particular role in implementing the model. I just wanted to introduce the other panelists. On my extreme right, we have Miss Natalie O'Brady of the Rape Crisis Society. She acted as a training facilitator and resource person at in various components of the workshop, and she was starring in the video we saw this morning. We also have next to her Ms. Tisha Nickenig, who was our indefatigable project coordinator, but she also worked very closely with the evaluation consultant during that process. We have Dr. Rowena Kalu, assistant lecturer at UTT, who, with her partner, her colleague, Ms. Ramona Khan, led the parenting workshops in Charlottesville and in Aranjuez. And now we are joined by Michelle Searles, who was the, Maureen Searles, sorry, who was the intervention coordinator for a significant period of the community interventions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Reid certainly did amazing task in giving us a holistic picture of that model. She has provided us with a lot of information, and yes, she deserves a round of applause, which kind of cut into my task. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing will be somewhat subjective, a lot of my experience. As Professor Reddock mentioned, I was contracted to be one of the facilitators working on 2 communities, working with the teachers and working with some of the members of the communities. The teachers' workshops were targeted, they're supposed to be held during the lunchtime period. And if there are any teachers in the room, you would know that that in itself came with a number of challenges, because teachers usually hold on very dearly to their lunch period. So that in itself gave us a little bit of a challenge, but nonetheless, they were willing. And then when you go into the schools, you realize that there isn't an ideal space, because we want to talk about a topic that most people don't want to talk about, they don't feel comfortable talking about. And then coming from a class of probably a whole lot of rowdy, mischievous young people into an environment where you're now going to talk about this difficult issue in itself, for me, that created, added a bit of challenge to the dynamic. Specifically in Toko, looking at the space that we had to work with, because you understand that the ambience of an environment can also do something in allowing for one to be a little more open to receive. But we were forced to work with the staff room, lots of books and all that stuff inside, and that in itself could have taken away a bit from, but nonetheless, the teachers that came, which were most of the teachers, were curious, a little bit hesitant at first, but then they got into the process. One of the things that I recognize is that the teachers were actually glad for the opportunity to share some of their experiences. Now, the model that I used in training the teachers was somewhat psychoeducational in frame, where we wanted to not just give them new information, but we wanted to also get them to think about or talk about or identified their values, their beliefs, as it related to the issue in itself, and that is issues in particular, child sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS. So the space, giving them that opportunity to think and realize the various scenarios, did help. Our teachers are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed because they are frontliners, as you would know, so they would be the ones that gets the first disclosure oftentimes, and the students most times don't want to talk with the guidance officer if there's one present in the school or assigned to the school. So that in itself created a challenge in that how can we now support a process, support these teachers in their capacity of one, first delivering the heavy curriculum as we mentioned this morning by one of my colleagues on the floor, but also in terms of being that safe space or that safe person that the child can. The workshop also helped the teachers to be able to identify and understand some of the behaviors they were seeing among some of the students in their class. The people in the community were willing. They wanted to be there. And again, based on what Dr. Reid said, it had a lot to do with the ethnographers who were in the community, therefore laying the framework, so that by the time we got in and began to facilitate, they were ready. They were really ready. The space there, again, was different in that one of the things, and plug, that we need to be mindful of is that we cannot talk about sexual abuse, sexual violence, incest, in a group without having a few members in the group who were also survivors of. It's very, very important. And therefore, one of the things that I think the project failed to do was to put strategies in place to deal with that element of it. Because I did 2 sessions in Tobago, that at one of the sessions, someone came, not quite sure what they were doing, coming, but it was just too much. They couldn't stay. They just couldn't deal with it. That thing that is created is one that was psychoeducational in the sense that I'm going to bring new information, but hear what? I want to hear how you interact with it. And while at the same time, you cannot help others if you don't know where you are at as an individual. And there was universality among the group. And that in itself created a synergy or momentum that would have spilled off into the group, or the women's empowerment group that was later formed in Tobago. So for me, just keeping that in mind, if you're going to be doing a project like this, you have to have sufficient support persons on the ground to manage disclosures effectively. In terms of the sustainability of the project, I still have a couple questions as far as that is concerned. The community beginning to the whole process of self-healing, but then you need that external support. And this is where the external support for the facilitators and the continued support, because we want these women support groups to continue as long as possible, as long as the community needs it. But then you need to have, we have the levels of the layperson, the paraprofessionals, but we need to also have the professionals going in to help them to work through and to better deal with the stories that are coming out and to provide the support effectively for the women who are participating in this group. And that is basically my experience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for having me here. As Professor Reid pointed out, the Parent Skills Workshop was facilitated by myself and my colleague Ramona Khan, with excellent support from Maureen, who was there for most of the workshops, and Tracy, who isn't here today. Right? Now, while the BTS project has focused largely on education and advocacy around sexual abuse and incest in our children, our work, that is the workshops that Ramona and myself did, address the broader cultural environment which facilitates or hinders positive and healthy relationships between adults and children, and which can therefore serve as a protective factor, or conversely, one that increases children's vulnerability to abuse. Culture surrounding parenting styles, discipline, communication, power relationships are such intimate aspects of family life that they remain often unexamined and unspoken. Yet, as youth show symptoms of disenfranchisement and alienation from their society, interestingly, parents often become the first group to be blamed for the misdemeanors of their children. We believe that by providing a forum through which parents could examine those taken for granted cultures of child rearing, they could become aware of their strengths, needs, as well as their power as a community to shape the lives of their children. Indeed, parenting is not just an individual business, as our participants testified, but was shaped by the values and norms of the immediate and wider community. The broad goal of our workshops was therefore to provide parents with a forum where we could share knowledge of child development and parenting strategies while developing skills in communication and group facilitation. At the end of the sessions, we hope that parents would be empowered to begin their own parenting support groups, or at least begin to see themselves as catalysts for shaping their family lives and the lives of their community. Our workshops consisted of 4 sessions, and they took place in 2 communities, Aranguez and Charlottesville. The Aranguez community consisted of what I would call 4 faithful parents. It began large and got smaller and smaller, but these 4 parents stuck with it to the end. And the Tobago group was a much larger group, maybe at least a dozen parents. The Trinidad session took place over 4 to 5 weeks, 1 session per week on weekdays after work, whereas the Tobago session took place on 2 weekends. All right. Now, despite these structural and cultural differences between the communities, and some of that was brought out by Dr. Reid, the responses to the work to Ramona and I were surprisingly similar. The first session asked parents to describe personal and group goals for a parenting support group. Participants identified skills and knowledge they felt were needed for them as individual parents as well as community activists. And those goals actually became the basis for the sessions which followed. So at each session, we went back to those goals and said, are we fulfilling the goals of the participants? Session 2 provided information on stages of child development and their relationship to their children's behavior and disciplinary approaches. Session 3 broached the topic of child and youth sexuality, how it is defined, how it manifests itself, and implications for parenting. And session 4 examined the process of communication and methods of facilitation. Ramona and I created certain guidelines for the workshop, and it was only in my reflections post the Aranguez workshop that I realized that we had these guidelines without even writing them down. We had just internalized them over many years of doing community work and working with parents and teachers. And they were as follows. 1, provide participants with useful knowledge which was accessible. It should be accurate but jargon-free. Draw heavily on participants' experiences. Fulfill the objectives of being gendered, not by lecturing on gender, but infusing issues with a sensitivity to gender and human rights. Empower participants. Provide them with confidence to speak, to share, and to believe that they had the capacity to be organizers if they so desired. And provide a safe space psychologically and emotionally for sharing experience, and also a space in which hierarchies were absent as far as that was possible. So the role of the facilitator would be truly to facilitate rather than to dictate. This conversion from objective to action was grounded in our methodology. Each workshop began with a warm-up session, which wasn't just a warm-up session. It was fun. It stimulated open conversations and was chosen as a transition to the topic. For instance, in the first warm-up, we asked participants to, we gave each person like a tag, and they had to write their names, an adjective, and a symbol which represented who they felt they were as parents, and they had to share the meaning of that with the group. And that opened up conversations to the objectives of a parenting support group, what they would want to see out of it. Right? Session 2 involved everyone bringing a photograph of their child or children and sharing something about the meaning of this picture. And this was a really deep session for many parents, you know, helping them to think of how much they really loved their children and cared for them. And this allowed us to open up discussions about child development and discipline. Session 3 began with a power walk, where we asked participants to reflect on their experience of sexuality while they were youths and their experiences now. This created lots of laughter and broke the silence on this intimate topic. So we'd have questions like, did you ever have a crush on someone and they did not know? Well, everyone giggled, and everyone, the facilitators included, walked to the other end of the room in affirmation of experiencing this aspect of growing up. Did you feel that boys had more sexual freedom than girls when you were dating? This question led to a gender discussion on attitudes to girls and boys as they began wanting to explore their sexuality and relationships and the restrictions that girls experience. And for the women in the group, it also brought out the feelings of resentment and injustice that they experienced while they were going through this phase of their life. This is an example of how gender was infused into the session rather than given to the participants. By the time we came to the question, do you feel your personal experiences influence your attitude towards your own children and their sexuality? The door was open for discussion and sharing on a topic, both intimate and often uncomfortable amongst families, more so among strangers, which we were, of course, to the members of the workshop. In the last session, we began with a drawing activity. One person drew something, the other person who could not see what they drew had to draw the same thing based purely on the artist's direction. The hilarious end products brought out the way in which people could share a common language and culture and still not be able to communicate clearly what they desired of the other person. And this set the stage for open discussion on how we communicate with each other, and in particular with the other, our children. At the end of this last session, our closing activity was one where participants went through an obstacle course to find cards placed around the room. The words on the card reflected the characteristics for effective facilitation: confidentiality, respect, creating a safe space. And participants had to interpret these concepts. What came out in this was how much participants had internalized during these just 3 sessions, because in interpreting the cards, they were actually given examples of what we had done within the workshop. So we were not just people giving information, we were actually models of how to facilitate a workshop. Though more theoretical knowledge took the form of like mini lectures, these sessions were also framed in participants' active involvement in the process. For example, we introduced the participants to Erickson's stages of psychosocial development, something you would think that just social workers or teachers would be introduced to in their training. However, we began with participants' own experience of children's behavior at different ages and use these experiences for the theory to emerge. Indeed, I remember one of the participants in Charlottesville said, you know, we would have to go to a university to get this information. So this praxis of theory, activity, and personal experience became the methodological cornerstone that allowed us to broach topics that were personal and intimate and contextualize them in the community and a broader theoretical framework. It is through this framework, I believe, that participants were able to actively construct knowledge which was authentic and relevant to their lives. At the closing session, we noted that persons were publicly committed to using the information and skills that they had gained. There was a clear sense to me that participants were empowered and confident, and the follow-up sessions, the development of the parenting support groups, the marches that have occurred seem to suggest that there was some sustainability that came out of this work. Though the sessions were stressful, particularly in Trinidad, because they were happening after work for all of us, and there was actually an advantage in that weekend session in Tobago. There was no doubt that these sessions were deep and rich in their knowledge base, both experiential and theoretical, and importantly, often full of laughter. The workshop seemed to bring out the power of facilitation based on the principles of participation, equity, and respect. Further, the session spoke to the power of the message. The methodology seemed to be able to negotiate a respectful way to help participants to reflect on individual relationships and broader cultural values that are taken for granted of everyday life, and therefore some of the more complex and intimate issues that all parents have to deal with, often in silence. All participants seemed to move beyond the boundaries of their traditions and cultures. Everyone seemed to be thinking of, or at least questioning their relationships with their children, rethinking their biases and stereotypes, reaffirming the positives, searching for solutions to the negatives. All of this with the understanding that it was not about becoming a perfect parent, but a reflective one. As a caveat, though, it must be noted that each person in the group was already engaged in community work at some level, whether in their mosque, church, PTA, or, as in the case of one participant, just an advisor or listener in her beauty salon. Even before the session ended, participants were telling us how they were sharing their information. I am unsure if these sessions would work for all kinds of communities. Clearly, participants had the educational level which allowed them to absorb and internalize the material. We questioned whether some of the persons who came to the Orangware session just once felt removed from the process, suggesting different tools and intervention strategies for different populations. Despite these obvious reservations, the warm end to the sessions, the confidence and camaraderie between everyone who took part, and the follow-up actions seemed to be, at least to Ramona and myself, a testimony to the relevance and empowering effect of sensitive community intervention with clear goals grounded in issues of social justice and a methodology which was committed to honoring community and individual knowledge and experience. Okay, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm actually here speaking on behalf of Ms. Elizabeth Lloyd, who was the CHRC consultant, the Caribbean Health Research Council consultant that we hired to really conduct the objective evaluation. But she could not be here due to an emergency. She's out of the country, so I stepped in. I did work with Elizabeth consistently throughout the project, so I am quite aware about the evaluation methodology. So I think I can give you a little bit of information. I think the first thing that I'd like to just bring up is, I think, which was very different of this project from many projects that I've been involved in, and others have been involved in, including Liz. She told me out of her whole experience of evaluation, I think she's been working for 15 years plus, she said this was the most complex and detailed project she's ever been involved in terms of the evaluation. Because this was partly because one of our partners, the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, was so adamant on really integrating the evaluation process throughout the entire project design. So from day one, we were thinking evaluation, 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 not let's do the workshops and then hire evaluation consultants and bring them in after and do a little focus group and that's it. So I just, that's something to just keep in mind as you're thinking through your models and your different projects that you are starting. If you actually want to get data to prove effectiveness, that's something to really keep in mind. From day one, you really need to start thinking evaluation. So we came up with all of the documents, the evaluation plan, the evaluation framework, where we examined, each component of the project. We documented the desired outcome. We talked about the how that component was going to be measured, such as the percentage of persons who demonstrated an ability, an increased ability to discuss child sexual abuse, and which tools we were going to use. Dr. Reid touched upon some of these tools that we attempted to use in the beginning. We tried a more written documents, quite a few written documents. We pre-post test, all of those types of things that were not really effective. For the various reasons that Dr. Reid mentioned. Time was a huge thing because we only had a certain amount of time, as Natalie was talking about, during a teacher's lunchtime seminar. They're a little, their attention span is limited as it is. We're just happy that they're there. And then to ask them, pre and post to really test their knowledge of everything is a little much, as Maureen can probably talk more on. So I'm not really going to go into all of those challenges, but there were many, and trying to come up with a perfect evaluation method to really look at the impact and the outcomes of these different workshops. What we finally came up with were pre and post evaluation scenarios. The important thing about these scenarios were we always had note takers. So as Dr. Reid discussed, we had note takers that were trained in ethnographic methodology. So they were not only just taking notes of the session and what people said, but also really looking at verbal, nonverbal cues and really, looking at those things. And that feeds into how people learn. And it tells you a lot. So that definitely was always, all those note takers, sometimes two, usually one, were always there. And that was an important part of the evaluation as well, because as Dr. Reid discussed, there were certain components of the workshop, of the project, such as the street theater workshops, where we would go into bars and basketball fields and cricket fields, and we hired Arts in Action to do these fantastic performance theater education workshops. And while there was so much feedback and conversation going on with these men and boys and the people in the bars and the cricket fields and the football fields, there was absolutely no way we were going to start handing out paper or asking them to formally go through a pre-post evaluation scenario. We were just happy for them to be standing there talking about this very taboo topic of child sexual abuse and masculinities and femininities, and that they're willing to talk about it, right? So what we did was we just had the note takers there and trained again in ethnographic methodologies. So I feel we got quite good data from that. Some of the other workshops that we did not do the pre-post evaluation scenarios were the cottage meetings and Oranguas, which were actually very effective. They were very informal discussions facilitated by resource persons. Maureen was one of them, and various others just talking about the various topics related to child sexual abuse. And again, these were just informal discussions for about an hour in the back of someone's home, in their garage. There was no way we were going to do the formality of evaluations with those types of workshops. So we felt that with the notes and then all of these other more formal education, and particularly the skills building workshops, with the more formal pre-post evaluation scenarios that we did do, and I'll go through, we felt we did gather enough data. And also, just to mention, there was the primary school children's workshops, and there's no way we were going to go through the formal, those children were way too young. What we did with them was afterwards we asked them to just write a story or draw a picture of how they felt about the workshop and the topics discussed in the workshop. And that actually gave us a lot of data that we have actually in the office that we're hoping we can have looked at a little bit further and analyzed a little bit further. And then also the secondary school education workshops. Those children were old enough, I would say, to go through some formal evaluations, but the time was so limited, so we did do focus groups afterwards, which I'll get into a little. But I thought it would be interesting to take us through some of the pre-post evaluation scenarios and some of the reactions, just to give you an idea of what we did. So the first one was, imagine that you are a mother or father of an 11-year-old girl, and you pass by her room and find your 20-something-year-old sibling peeping at her when she is changing her clothes. Your daughter tells you it is not the first time. And then the first question would be, what do you think is happening there? Because we wanted to see, really, is this considered incest? Is this considered child sexual abuse at all? How would you feel and what would you do? So just to give you an example, before the workshop, a lot of the reactions on this question, talking about the mother, father, the 11-year-old girl, and passing by and seeing your sibling looking at your 11-year-old daughter, was feelings of shock, and then a lot of discussion about they would want to talk about it, talk about it with the child, really understand what's going on, but keep it within the family. So there was a lot of feelings of let's not take it out and discuss it in the community, never report it. There was, we wouldn't really want to do that, the confidentiality, it's my brother, it's my sister. So discussions about that. The children that we asked, because we did do these scenarios with the children in the poetry writing workshops, they blatantly said before the workshops that they did not want to tell anyone, including if they witnessed, let's say, because we changed it a little, saying if you saw, your uncle looking at your sister or something, they wouldn't want to tell anyone. Because they feared that, one, they would break up the family, and two, there was discussions that people just wouldn't believe them, and the kids actually said this. And then all of the workshop participants definitely said they would not go to the police. They felt that the confidentiality issues with the police were not effective, and that they just don't trust the police. After the workshop, there was so after we went through all of the different, education and skills building surrounding topics of child sexual abuse, parenting, there was more discussions about believing the child, which was happy for us. So not just, trying to ask them so many questions. Are you sure this happened? Are you sure you were really feeling the right way? There was more discussions about, yes, I would actually believe them. And in the case of the children, bringing the issue to someone's attention that they trust. So after the workshop, they were talking about, okay, I would actually go and maybe not my parent, maybe not tell mommy or daddy, but maybe auntie or, maybe miss at school. So they did talk about, and they started naming the different resources that are available, such as Childline, and some of the mediation centers in their own communities that they learned about in the workshops. So that was certainly an outcome that was favorable. Another scenario, do I have some time? Okay, another scenario was I wanted to bring up the fact that imagine that a mother or father of an 11-year-old boy, and you pass by his room and find your 20-something-year-old sibling peeping at him while he was changing his clothes. So we changed the sex. And before the workshop, people were really just reflecting upon this, saying, oh, right, they never even considered that this could happen to a boy. So that was, something. And then after the workshop, it was just more discussions, more informed discussions about how gender ideologies really affect how boys are treated in situations of abuse. So there was more awareness about that, which was fantastic. And there was also discussions about how, people there was an awareness among the community members that, a lot of people don't even think of it as abuse when a little boy will have sex with miss of age 20 years old. There was talk about that and kind of an awareness of that, yes, this is child sexual abuse. And there was a lot of discussion. It sounded like the first time that, oh yeah, well, boys can't really talk about that because they're told that they're sissies, or there's accusations of being gay because they do not want to have sex with the woman. So there was discussions, and it was the first time that community members were really talking about these gender issues that are so important that we were trying to educate them about and just bring up and have discussions about. Imagine that the person who's peeping was a family friend. What would your opinion change? Sorry. Okay, so I just wanted to bring up that if it was a family friend and it wasn't actually within the family, there was a lot of more violent reactions, and yes, they would go to the police instead of trying to keep it more hushed. So that was an interesting finding as well. Overall, I'm going to go through this really. I'm going to skip over a lot. I think that overall, it was really effective. As I mentioned, we went into the communities after, and we did do some focus groups along with all these pre-post scenarios. And we really just did find that they were very effective, that it was an enlightening experience for me too, because I learned that some of the workshops that we didn't think were that effective, such as the health fair, the community said within the context of all the other workshops that were going on was actually very effective because it raised community awareness. So you can't just maybe do it alone, but that within the context of doing it within all of these different series of education and skills building and support services, that it actually is a needed thing, and it was very good. And I was also very pleased to hear that the participants really did gain an understanding of how ideologies of gender are important, because they shape constructions of masculinity and femininity. So that was something. And then I just want to conclude with 3 major lessons that I feel came out of this whole thing from the evaluations. And one is just that people do want to talk about sex and the related issues, including such taboo topics such as child sexual abuse and incest. They're ready to talk. They want to talk. The evaluation scenarios actually even helped that discussion. It facilitated the discussion, so it was a very good way of doing evaluation, we found. And you can't generalize. I think that, you must privilege the individual experiences, which is why the social science way, the ethnographic way that we did things was so key. And also just partnering the perspectives of the frontline activists, such as Natalie and Rowena and Maureen, and the academics, as well as the community members, just makes for such a richer understanding of the data. So that's it.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief because you need to understand that I worked with CAD, as the CADV representative in the communities for most of the project, and most of the community intervention. I attended, as Rowena said, I think I may have missed about 2 or 3 of the workshops or educational sessions, so that my experience, we can't start to talk about it. What I'm going to highlight is a couple of things that really stood out for me. One of them is that every time it happened, I was surprised when we were in a room with 20 or 12 randomly chosen people, that so many of them would disclose that they were survivors of child sexual abuse or sometimes domestic violence. I don't know why. We went into this and people said it was prevalent, but for some reason I think I didn't expect the kinds of numbers. It also surprised me when so many women told me that I was the first person they were saying that to. The other thing that disappointed me so much, I think, was that so little had changed with respect to the type of responses that people get when they disclose or when they are going through, whether it's child sexual abuse or domestic violence. The stories, all followed the same. Nobody believed me. And as a matter of fact, one of the phenomena that Tracy and I, who both worked at CADV, noted, one woman put it this way: you don't tell anybody because it's making you want to kill yourself. That whole thing about people immediately turn it back on you. You must have looked for it. And those are just 2 of the many experiences that I really want to share, but I'll be willing to answer any specific questions because there are a host of things that came up during this 12 to 18 months when we were in the communities. Thanks.
So the floor is now open for comments, questions. Thanks very much to the panelists so far. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on something Natalie talked about with respect to when people disclosed in the communities, when we were out there. It's something that we discussed at length, how to deal with it. We did try to get people who were resident in the communities, who were professionals, to be present. Because of the communities, obvious, well, maybe not obvious, but because of the communities we're in, that wasn't possible. We did try to get professionals from outside of the communities to be there, but we were in Toco. To do a session in Toco meant taking a day off for a professional. And our budget didn't include anything like the kind of money that most professionals could make in one day. So I just want to publicly thank all those people who graciously accepted our offer when we asked them to facilitate workshops or education experiences. When Natalie talks about going to Tobago to talk to teachers for 1 hour, that was a day, because it takes you 2 hours to get there, and then it's 2 hours to get back, and you know. So that I acknowledge what she says. We did at times manage to provide, you know, because we kept talking to people all the time. So somebody would say, oh, I'm available on one day, and you'll take them with you so that the person who may have disclosed the last time has access to somebody to talk to at that point, and we would tell them that. So the times that Natalie, I want to say this, all the persons who disclosed had access, not necessarily on that day, but they all did have access to a professional to speak with at some point during the process. And I know that that isn't the ideal situation, but it was what we could have done under the circumstances. And we did provide them with the opportunity for follow-up with resources either in the immediate environment. Then you understand, we in Charlottesville, we in Tobago. Aranguez was easier, but you know, there are the logistics of the follow-up, and we're aware of that as well. People in those areas didn't want to go to anybody who was in their area in the first place. So the Charlottesville person would want to go to somebody in Scarborough. The Tobago person doesn't even want to go to Sandra Grande. The nearest they would want to go to is KArima. So we, you know, just be aware that, you know, all those things, so that you have to build, I think, funding would have to cater for these kinds of scenarios in your planning phases. Thanks.
Thanks, Maureen. That was a really important contribution.
At one point, I got the impression that it was a kind of, you were going into the communities selected to do an assessment as to what the community regarded their needs to be. And then I'm hearing things that speak to an implementation of, so I'm not sure which is it? Is it both, or is it?
Okay, the project had different phases. Initially, part of the project, the project team went into when they decided on what the communities were, they went into the communities and tried to determine who were the influential people in the communities. Because you needed to have somebody on the inside who would champion the cause of the Breaking the Silence project. So initially there were stakeholder meetings, and these people would have been at the level of principals of schools, district nurses, the sergeant in the police station, you know, religious leaders. Those types of people were targeted, and you talked to them about the project. And as a project, we get to the intervention, and they would also advise us to, because we had a plan when we went in initially. We thought we had the perfect plan, this community caravan that would go in, da-da-da. When we started to talk to these people, you started to realize, maybe not. And then what these people did was talk to other people in the communities, so that now that's how our community team was built. And these were the people that we met with regularly, who really sat down with us and said, here it is. This is not who we are. This is not what we want. What would work for us is. What we would really like to see is. And like Tisha was just saying, that's one of the beauties of this project, why the academic Institute for Gender and Development Studies and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, why that partnership was so important. Because even as we were a team, my and CADV's goal was very different from theirs. You know, we had one big goal, but we really wanted to leave something in the community. So even as we planned the implementation, which was to get, we never forgot it, the goal was to get data. With everything that we did, the goal was to get data. We knew, we understood that perfectly. But it was really important to us. So as we implemented, we ensured that we left information with people, that we educated people, that we gave them skills. So it was two different phases. There was the planning, and then there was the implementation. And the implementation phase is where CDV really worked in the field. The IGDS provided the note takers and the recorders, but we really planned to get maximum. You know, we pushed for things like, if we have to get people coming to Togo, we have to provide them with transportation. Yes, it may not have been in the budget initially, but the guy from Sanssouci is not coming to Togo if he doesn't know how he's getting back home. You know, we have to finish at 10 to 8 so that the people who live in Balandra could go and get the 8 o'clock bus, which is the last bus leaving too. You follow? So that, it really worked. I think that was key to this project. So that we had, you know, we had the researchers ensuring that whatever we did, the evaluation was being done, and then you had a CADV on the ground with the communities saying, we need to get the best people. So Rena will tell you, you know, Rena, please, how you can work it. Tell us what days. Rena, it has to be after work. It can't be during the day. We can't do this the other thing is in Togo, you have a lot of people a lot of Christians, but then you have a high population of Seventh-day Adventists. So when we had anything to do on a weekend, we'll do it this week on a Saturday, next week on a Sunday. So that at least they'll get some of it, or somebody might sacrifice church one week. But it was different phases of the same project.
Thank you. I want to begin by again adding my congratulations to the team. This is very exciting work, yes. And coming from a ministry with a research department, I was saying to myself, you know, why didn't we let some of our officers be part of this? But also heartened because I believe there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration with you all in terms of taking things forward. And just to share too that in particular for the community caravans, because as the chair of the Task Force for Children Protection, we have been thinking about going into communities and the schools with caravans and getting the feedback from you on what you've learned is certainly instructive for us in terms of what we were thinking. And because we are at the early stage, I'm really happy that there's information that you could share and that will help us in terms of how we go into the communities, yes? But in terms of what I've heard too, I just wanted to ask, you know, how were the children involved? How were children involved in the research? Because we've done some community work too in terms of the task force and getting feedback from 4 communities too, and one was Togo. So again, that information is really important in terms of what we got out of our forum and what you got out of yours. But at all these sessions, children really were not involved in giving input and feedback and so on. And I would like to, probably I missed it, but I would just like to know if they were involved, and if not, you know, was it a challenge to get them involved, or was it that you all didn't think there was a way to get them involved? Because this is all about them too, yes? Thanks.
Okay, what we decided to do with respect to the young people, Arts in Action was heavily involved in that. Arts in Action out of the creative, I always get it wrong.
Department of Creative and Festival Arts.
Yes, at the university. We really sat down and planned what were the goals again, and Arts in Action developed these scenarios. They do education in drama and education, theater and education. So what they did was they went into the school. Well, of course, we had to liaise with the principals, etc. And we identified, because of the period, we started off with, in the secondary schools, children who in Form 3, so that it would have gone over to Form 4. And they did these scenarios that really dealt with specific topics within the framework of the project. And they would go in, they would do these scenarios, and the children, yes, it was so interesting. The first one we did was in Charlottesville. And we go to Charlottesville and we're told where we could meet. And there were some boys in a basketball field. And we just went to them and said, we could, you know, hang out with you all for a little while. And it was so interesting that these boys stopped their basketball game and engaged us for 2 hours. and how relevant it was to them, because, I mean, Arts in Action is really good at what they do. So the children were always involved. You always had those who, you know, some children by who they are won't be, but challenges again is when you have a session going on, and for some reason school finishes early. So the bell goes and everybody else is leaving, and you know, your kids are still there. But I think arts and the drama really helped. It gave them a voice in that at the end of the session, they would get to pick one of the characters and put them in the hot seat and ask them questions. And you learned a lot from the questions that were asked and the comments that were made. The note takers are really important here too, because there was a lot happening while this was going on. While the presentations are being done, the drama, there's a lot happening with the children who are sitting there. The things they're whispering to each other, their reactions. You see verb, you see facial expressions, you see body language that tells you certain things. With the younger ones, what we did was, there's a group, Tassa, the late Samantha Pierre led that group, and she did, we call them broadly storytelling workshops around the Blue Teddy. So Samantha went in there, and it was really interesting to see these younger children, and they will tell, and the Teddy took on a life of his own in Charlottesville with these little children, really, because that was the only place we had primary school children. And the children made up stories. They gave the Teddy names. They decided if it was going to be a boy or a girl. And they talked about why the Teddy had a plaster on his heart. And, you know, and that is how it evolved with the younger ones. And they were especially little children. They're eager to tell you the story. And Samantha had songs and that kind of thing. And at the end of it, as Professor Reid, Tisha was saying, you know, they would draw the Teddy. They would color him differently because now he's no longer sad. You know, a lot of activities that really allowed for them to vocalize what they probably wouldn't have said if you'd asked them a direct question. So that the last time I was in Charlottesville, and I was the Blue Teddy lady. You know, the children look at you, because, you know, when they see you, you're the Blue Teddy lady. Yeah.
I just want to add two things that I think are very important to take away in terms of involving the children. The first one is that you have to remember we went into the communities and had plenty of community team meetings where we actually formed community teams with community members, and they became part of the decisions on how to approach the different children, how to deal with this. So it was part of their decision. It was a gaining of trust, and I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, in terms of the actual permission, I mean, we really had to go through a lot of ministry permission, teacher permission, principal permission, parent permission, right? So those are just two things to take away, yeah.
First, I take this opportunity to appreciate the project team. So I request all the participants to join with me in appreciating. Give them a big clap. Thank you. So I have one question to Dr. Reid. What are the support and rehabilitation system designed for the victims? What are the support and rehabilitation systems designed? Yeah. And second thing is, I have a suggestion that if you recommend to the Ministry of Education to include a lesson as awareness and preventive measures at the school level.
Second question is very easy to answer. The answer to that one is yes. All right? Because we have shown that by going into the schools and using age-appropriate interventions, the children do respond. So once we get our evaluation data out to show that, in fact, the children did have an increase in awareness and knowledge, and so it means that there is no reason why the Ministry of Education should not adopt this to use as a strategy. They can probably incorporate it in their current family life curriculum, which is the curriculum that now looks at things like sexuality and family life. So that one, I would say yes. Your first question about how did we deal with victims of child sexual abuse, Now, the project did not specifically target victims of child sexual abuse. We went into the communities in general, and we did these interventions with general community members. Our challenge was not so much finding strategies for victims we found, but it was, should somebody disclose that they were being abused, what would we then do? So the anticipated scenario was that, for example, someone might be participating in one of the Arts in Action theater activities. And because of the emotions that can be evoked during this activity, should they come and say, I am being sexually abused by my stepfather or my uncle or my cousin or whatever, we as a project team had a responsibility to provide some kind of intervention for that child. When we looked at our methodology, we were more concerned about disclosure from children. But as far as I know, and Maureen will be able to tell me, we had no disclosures from children. What we got were adults who disclosed that they had been molested as children. Our plan did not specifically include these adults, but we were able to apply to them the plan that we had in place for children. And what we had decided we would do, and this is what got the ethical approval, is that for every community, we would identify in that community a resource professional, whether it's a social worker, a medical doctor, a psychologist, somebody who had the skills to be able to intervene. We decided that if the community didn't have one, we would bring someone into the community. We were willing to pay an on-call allowance for this person who would literally be on call should a crisis occur. The biggest challenge we had was the reporting issue. The law states that if someone discloses, you must report. And that generated most of the discussion. We eventually took the coward way out, and we decided that we were not going to do the reporting. Our middle person, the professional, would then direct the person, the victim, to the appropriate organization in their community. So we put the responsibility of the reporting on the professional in the community. So our plan, therefore, was to have someone on call. Should a child disclose, that child would immediately receive attention. That's called crisis intervention. And thereafter, they would be channeled to the appropriate resources. We instead used that plan for the adults who disclosed. And as you heard from Maureen, sometimes the intervention was not immediate. It was